Greetings, my name is Susan Stevenson and I'm the Director of the Freedom Wellbeing Institute. This is a webinar about the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool. In this webinar, I'm going to talk to you about one of the outcomes of a 16-year wellbeing research program that was conducted in New Zealand. So emerging from this research program has been the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool. The research program that led to the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool began as a search to identify an evidence-based wellbeing model and practices that were capable of supporting understandings and measurable improvements in wellbeing. The aspirations of the researchers were to progress engagement, participation, retention, achievement, productivity and equity outcomes in higher education and other settings. The researchers focused on 4 questions. What is well-being? I can tell you we found nearly 1,000 definitions of well-being. We also focused on how is well-being influenced, how can well-being be measured, and how can well-being be improved over time. We were hunting for evidence-based solutions to these, or answers to these questions. The methods used were diverse. We used themed literature reviews, meta-theory reviews, use-inspired practice research, traditional research, quantitative, qualitative and mixed method investigations, and also impact evaluation and grounded theory. There have been 4 findings from this wellbeing research program: the Universal Wellbeing Model, the Universal Wellbeing Determinants, a definition of universal wellbeing, and the focus of this particular webinar, the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool. To understand more about the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool, it's first best to understand a little more about the Universal Wellbeing Model which underpins the tool. So in this particular picture, this is an abbreviated picture of the model, and this just shows 2 of the 4 components in the Universal Wellbeing Model. So the first component in the Universal Wellbeing Model are what we call sensory inputs. So these are all the things we see, hear, smell, taste and touch that impact our universal well-being over time. And these experiences can be real life encounters, or they could be via digital means. So digital means can be powerful and impact our well-being just as much as real life experiences. Now, when these inputs actually come to us, our brain gets busy and starts processing those sensory inputs to understand what they actually mean. And one of the first things the brain does is identify whether these inputs constitute some kind of threat to us. And if they do, the brain will take automatic and swift action to protect us. If a threat is not identified, then the brain will still continue to process the sensory inputs and work out actually what do they mean for us. And then whatever meaning the brain ascribes to these particular sensory inputs, it manifests as behaviours. So they could be social, physical, intellectual, ethnic, cultural, emotional or spiritual behaviours. Now in our research we've identified a number of specific behaviours that come through this channel of coming from sensory inputs, being processed and interpreted by our brain, which then manifests particular behaviours that have essentially determine our universal well-being level. So in this particular slide, I'm showing you the behaviours that have been identified as determining the status of our universal well-being. And each of these 70 determinants can be potentially very positive and supportive of our universal well-being, or it could be neutral, or it might be potentially harmful, or it might in fact be definitely harmful to our universal well-being. So these are of great importance in us understanding and being able to change the state of our universal well-being. Also critical are the overarching principles. So we have 5 principles that overarch the universal wellbeing model, that also overarch the universal wellbeing evaluation tool that I'm going to talk to you about. So these principles ensure that we view the picture of our universal wellbeing in a holistic way. We just don't focus on specific pieces, but we pull back, use higher and associative thinking to understand the full picture that's being presented, understanding that the universal wellbeing model is integrated, interlinked and interdependent. The components work together, and that all these components are of equal importance. So we are usually supporting people to have more balanced development and support for the universal wellbeing. And the model is also designed to empower people, to help them appreciate what universal wellbeing is and how they could enhance it. And finally, the model's been designed to be responsive to diverse individuals and collective differences in terms of, for example, ethnicity, culture, beliefs, age, and gender. So all of these principles apply whenever we not only look at the model, but also when we go on to look at the evaluation tool that is underpinned by this model. So in this particular slide, we have a copy of the Universal Wellbeing Model. If you'd like a copy of this, you can pick up a black and white one free off our website anytime. You can also get this nice colour one if you want to from our shop. But you can see here the 4 components, the sensory inputs in the centre, the behavioural dimensions through which these behaviours manifest, and then you can see the specific determinants of universal wellbeing that link to each of these dimensions, and then overarching everything are our principles being holistic, balanced, integrated, empowering and responsive. So it's really important for us to understand that the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool I'm now going to talk about is based upon and underpinned by this model and the research that led to its emergence. So the Universal Wellbeing Tool specifically asks people questions about the 70 determinants of universal well-being. So when people use the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool, they get a letter which allows them to access a secure website, and there they can work through a questionnaire. They get 5 choices for each question that's asked, and that allows them to self-assess the different areas included in the Universal Wellbeing Model. But there's a few extra things that become available through this Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool. So just so you know, the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool has been used successfully with diverse people, adult students, employees, and people over the age of 8 years of age since 2022. So the evaluation tool was digitised and nationally launched at New Zealand Tech Week 2024. And in July of 2024, Freedom Wellbeing Institute commenced running Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Facilitator Accreditation programs. And so these are for people who would like to be able to administer, analyse and report the outcomes of the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool either to individuals or to groups or companies or other people that they may work with and whose well-being they may be actively seeking to support. Now, the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation can identify a number of very important things. It can identify the status of the 70 universal wellbeing influencing variables or determinants. It can identify people's areas of strength and talent. It can identify areas where harm to universal wellbeing may or is occurring. It can identify the impact of each of the dimensions, so that is the social, physical, intellectual, cultural and ethnic, emotional and spiritual dimensions. Often people identify and find they have talents and strengths within those dimensions that they're not aware of. The evaluation can also identify the impacts of home, work and or study place. So specifically find out if those particular parts of our lives are supporting our universal wellbeing or potentially causing harm to us. The evaluation can also identify risks such as potential physical violence and suicidal ideation. So these things also emerge from the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool. The Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool can empower the people who receive these reports to make changes, and it can also support them to and prevent poor well-being through what we call well-being literacy, which is understandings of what universal well-being is and what influences it either in positive or negative directions. Now, the universal wellbeing model is confidential. It is conducted under professional and research and ethical principles and approvals. The Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tools are analysed only by professionally accredited facilitators, and the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool can include and lead to individual reports, or we can produce what are called organisational data summary reports, and these can be anonymised or the identity of people can be shared if those people doing the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool agree to a privacy waiver to certain people. So the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool can contribute to wellbeing literacy of individuals, but also across a whole organisation and drive and support wellbeing support systems. The Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool is privacy and cyber protected, and we'll let you know that it's also constantly being researched. Consent, of course, is required for anyone's data to be contributed to that research. Now, one of the great things about these data summary reports that organisations often want is they provide a basis for what we call evidence-based decision making. So often organisations are running wellbeing programs and that are what we call reactive. So if someone asks for something, organisations to get information and then to design and provide supports and interventions based on real life data. So this means that people running systems like this can actually be proactive and they can actually prevent some of the worst outcomes of poor well-being that can occur in a workplace. So the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool, when run across an organisation, can foster a whole of organisation universal wellbeing literacy and support systems. It can measurably increase productivity, achievements and equity outcomes. And it can also promote an organisation doing what we call before and afters, so pre and post tests. So not only can they find out what their staff need, put in supports or interventions, but they can also check if those actually worked in a measurable way. So the provision of these universal wellbeing evaluations to staff and organisations, it's very quick. The questionnaire takes only about 30 minutes for people to actually complete. It requires low investment, it's accurate, and it really supports you to prevent poor universal wellbeing and its outcomes in your organisation. Another one of the major outcomes we found of these organisational systems is that it fosters a positive, caring and engaged culture. So not only do staff in the organisation learn about their own universal wellbeing, but they also start to build understandings of how their own behaviours might, for example, impact the universal wellbeing of other people. And this really develops empathy and positive care, which means that organisations can really take off and focus on productivity, profit, and the kind of outcomes they're wanting to achieve. Other things we've found that the anonymised Universal Wellbeing Data Summary reports, that is Universal Wellbeing Evaluation on a whole team of staff does, it helps to identify strengths in the organisations, real needs, opportunities and risks. It can support decision making and it can promote the prevention of poor wellbeing and its outcomes. So one of the most stressful things that many organisations deal with are what we would call often predictable poor prevention events. This can be accidents at work, it could be suicide at work, it could be risks of violence or bullying or other types of negative activities in a workplace. And what these evaluations can do is help organisations quickly find them and address them rather than waiting for events to become larger and end up being large crises for that organisation to work with. So the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool and data summaries for organisations promotes systems and what we call futures thinking. So it's about freeing up resources for the core business as opposed to the kind of taking of resourcing that can happen when a workplace is experiencing relatively low levels of well-being in its staff. Now, if you would like to learn more, we'd encourage you to go to our website and you can check out our programs. We have general programs that give information. For example, the Certificate in Universal Wellbeing helps people understand what universal wellbeing is, to understand all those determinants, how they impact them and their families, and perhaps to also see how they can contribute to better wellbeing in the workplace. And there are other professional programs listed here that you can get further information on. There's a program prospectus and some free resources available at the website. You can also go to our page about organisational wellbeing systems and see how these can be easily set up. So most of our systems about supporting internal wellbeing capability development within an organisation rather than an external and expensive drop-in system provided by other people. Now, if you are interested in setting up a whole of organisation wellbeing literacy or whole of organisation universal wellbeing system, don't hesitate to be in touch. Or you might be interested in using the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool and research that you're doing. If so, please don't hesitate to be in contact. Finally, we have a lot more information at our website at www.fwi.ac.nz. You can email at our contact us email. And I would encourage you to subscribe so you can get access to more of our YouTube videos that can give you further information about universal wellbeing and the Universal Wellbeing Evaluation Tool. I thank you for joining us today and I look forward to seeing you again.